A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, adapted by yours truly. Marley was as dead as a doornail. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. In London there was known to all, even to those who had never seen him, a man who was cold, greedy, and bitter towards his fellow man. His name was Ebenezer Scrooge, and he was a shrewd businessman, a money-lender, and while he was very successful and wealthy, he lived in a dismal old house, and his office was barely warmed by a fire, for Scrooge hated to buy coal. In fact, he hated to spend money on anything, preferring to keep his great wealth under lock and key than keep himself or his clerk, Bob Cratchit, in comfort. On Christmas Eve, 7 years after the passing of his business partner Jacob Marley, Scrooge went through the customary events of the day, as in years past, denying his nephew Fred's invitation to dinner on Christmas Day, and resignedly giving his clerk the whole day off. He was irritated when 2 gentlemen came by, seeking funds for the poor. He did not make himself merrier on Christmas time. He could not afford to make idle people merry. There were plenty of prisons and workhouses. Let the poor go there, or better yet, die off so he, Scrooge, could be left in peace. Scrooge left his office to visit those who owed him money, but the poor wretches could not repay him, and begged for more time. Scrooge reluctantly gave it, but added to the interest they owed him, negating the good deed it could have been in giving them more time. In his dismal house, Scrooge warmed a thin gruel for his supper and sat down to eat it. Suddenly, he heard the clock chime, and the little bell on his table began to ring, as did every bell in the house, all without moving. Once they ceased, Scrooge heard a terrible sound thundering towards him, something thumping against the steps of the stairs, and the rattling of chains. He had bolted the door, but that hardly mattered, as a ghostly form came through, and who should it be but his old partner, Jacob Marley. Scrooge could hardly believe his eyes, nor his ears, as Marley told him that he was visiting in hopes of saving Scrooge from facing the same fate as he. Bound in chains, Marley told Scrooge that he also had a chain, forged by his own actions. Of all the missed opportunities he could have done good, but was a miser instead. Without charity, the chain was made, and Marley's weighed heavily upon him. But Scrooge's was even greater, a ponderous chain to behold. Marley warned Scrooge that this would be his only chance to escape such a fate, and he would be visited by 3 ghosts, the first arriving at 1 o'clock, the second at 2, and the third, more mysterious than the others, would arrive in his own good time. Marley vanished, and Scrooge cried, "Bah, humbug!" before dashing to bed and pulling the covers over his head. Hardly had he closed his eyes, when Scrooge heard the great bell tower outside chime the hour. 1 o'clock? And the curtain around his bed was pulled aside, and bright light shone upon him. When the light dimmed, Scrooge was shocked to see a spirit beside his bed, looking neither old nor young, neither a boy nor a man. The spirit bade Scrooge to rise, saying, "We are going to look at your childhood." Ebenezer Scrooge was taken to his old schoolhouse, and shown a much younger version of himself, sitting all alone. Scrooge remembered how he was always left at school during Christmas break, never welcome at home, for his father had hated the sight of him. The ghost of Christmas past asked Scrooge what the matter was, and Scrooge grumbled about some children singing a Christmas carol outside his office earlier, and how he should have given them something. Then the spirit showed another Christmas, where Ebenezer's sister Fan came to get him, to bring him home, as his father had finally relented and allowed her to do so. The ghost of Christmas past showed young Scrooge apprenticed to Fezziwig, a kind and generous employer, who always looked after his workers, even when times were hard. And Fezziwig's daughter, the beautiful Isabel, the young lady Ebenezer had once been engaged to. Seeing Fezziwig, Scrooge remarked how he would have liked to have said a kind word to Bob Cratchit just then. Then the spirit showed a Christmas memory Scrooge had tried hard to forget, the death of his sister Fan, and young Ebenezer had hated the babe Fred she had borne, just as his own father had hated him when his mother died. Old Scrooge wept, and the spirit showed him his younger self becoming hard and cold towards the world, locking away any kindness deep within him, till only his pursuit for wealth remained. And Isabel, his once love, how she feared the man he had become, and released him from his promise, tearfully saying goodbye to the man she had once loved. Scrooge berated his younger self for not going after her, and just like that, he was back in his bed, alone and cold. Angry at himself for taking a trip down memory lane, Scrooge turned over to go to sleep, but the clock struck 2, and a booming laugh sounded from Scrooge's sitting room. He crept out of bed and approached, and looking in, he found the place decked from top to bottom with Christmas decorations, and a great feast prepared, and there, sitting on a chair on top of a pile of presents, was a giant, wearing a green robe and holding a torch. The ghost of Christmas present took the weary Scrooge to see the streets of London on Christmas Day, the one day of the year the poor and the rich cast aside their status to wish each other a Merry Christmas. And as they wandered, they came to a shabby but well-kept little house that was quite unknown to Scrooge, and it was the home of his clerk, Bob Cratchit. They went inside and found the family making ready for their Christmas dinner, and in came Bob Cratchit, carrying a little cripple boy on his shoulders, and they called the boy Tiny Tim. Scrooge watched as the family with 5 children sat down to a meager meal, a small goose that barely had enough meat for all, and a pudding from which there was only enough for each person to have 1 slice. And yet, the family was happy. No one complained. No one asked for more. And there was not a present to be seen. But still the Cratchit family sang carols and toasted the day. Bob Cratchit even toasted to his employer, much to the chagrin of his family, who begrudgingly obliged. And Tiny Tim, from his place by the fire, said, "God bless us, every one." Scrooge was struck by the happiness in the child, no sign of resentment for being crippled, and he asked the spirit if the boy would live. But the ghost of Christmas present said merely, "I see an empty place at the fire, and a crutch without an owner tenderly preserved." Scrooge implored the spirit to be wrong, and was shocked when the spirit quoted Scrooge, saying, "If he is like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." The very words Scrooge had said to 2 gentlemen who had visited him Christmas Eve. The ghost of Christmas present swept him away to his nephew Fred's house, and there, in a well-to-do house, with a feast far finer than Bob Cratchit's, Scrooge watched his nephew and his nephew's wife host a party, and here, too, Scrooge found himself being talked about. His nephew's friends called him odious and stingy, but Fred, his nephew, whom he had hated and turned away many a time, claimed to like Scrooge, for his mother's sake if nothing else, and said there must be an ounce of kindness left in him somewhere. Scrooge watched and was silent, thinking of all he had seen, and when the spirit pulled him away, he did not protest. They wandered the streets again, until they came to a place completely foreign to Scrooge, a place where there were no houses, no Christmas decorations, only campfires and people dressed in rags huddled around them. Scrooge watched as a family ate scraps for dinner and wished each other Merry Christmas, saying that next year things would be better. He turned to the spirit, demanding to know why these people were here, and the ghost of Christmas present showed him the prisons and the workhouses, and told him that many of the poor would rather die than ever go to those places. And Scrooge at last began to understand. And then he saw a foot, or a claw, peeking out from underneath the giant's robe, and was aghast when the spirit pulled back his robe and showed him 2 children, dressed in rags, and so thin they were little better than skeletons. "They are man's," the ghost of Christmas present said. "They cling to me for protection. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, but most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless it be erased." And then the spirit vanished, and Scrooge was left alone. He wandered to and fro, on unfamiliar paths, until he saw a black, shrouded figure ahead, waiting for him. And Scrooge knew he was in the presence of the ghost of Christmas future, and was about to be shown things that had not yet happened, but might happen. Without a word, the eerie spirit, as mysterious as Marley had said, took Scrooge to a place of business, a place Scrooge knew quite well, for he had been there many times. But this time Scrooge did not see himself, but instead overheard 2 men, whom he had done business with, discussing the funeral of a man who had recently died, and joking about perhaps they should go, as they didn't think anyone else would, and one hoped a luncheon would be provided. Shocked at how callously the men were talking about a man's death, Scrooge asked the spirit who they were talking about, and the ghost of Christmas future took him to a bedroom, where upon the bed a figure lay, covered by a white sheet. The spirit gestured for Scrooge to remove the sheet, and he was suddenly frightened. The spirit showed him some scenes upon the wall, where people expressed gratitude that the man was dead, for they would not have to pay their debts to him, and he begged the spirit to show him some tenderness connected with the death. The ghost of Christmas future engulfed Scrooge in shadows, and he found himself back in Cratchit's house, where the mood was very somber. Mrs. Cratchit and 4 of her children were gathered by the fireplace. There was no singing, no merriment, no meagre Christmas goose in sight. Mrs. Cratchit remarked that her husband should have been home already, and must be walking slower than usual, but he used to walk with Tiny Tim on his shoulders very fast indeed. Scrooge looked around, but seeing that Tiny Tim was not in sight, he demanded the spirit show him where the boy was, and the shadows moved, and Scrooge was in a graveyard, and there was Bob Cratchit, kneeling beside a freshly made grave, whispering that he had to leave Tiny Tim now, but not to be frightened. He would return the next day and keep his little boy company. And Scrooge wept as Bob Cratchit wept, and he watched his clerk slowly leave. Scrooge turned to the spirit and asked where was he in this future, and the ghost of Christmas future pointed. Scrooge, with great trepidation, walked past a row of gravestones until he came to another freshly made grave, and there, on the tombstone, he read his own name. Crying out, Scrooge fell to his knees before the spirit and begged it not to be so. He implored the spirit to tell him he could change. Why show me these things if I am beyond all hope? And Scrooge promised to keep Christmas in his heart and honor the past, present, and future, so that he would not forget the lessons they had taught him. And when Scrooge opened his eyes, he was back in his bedroom, and the bell was tolling 8 o'clock. He went to the window and looked out. A brand new day, and he wondered if it had all been a dream. But then he knew it had happened, and Scrooge opened the window. Seeing a young boy walk by, he called down to him, asking what day it was. Hearing that it was Christmas Day, Scrooge was ecstatic, and asked the boy to go round to the butcher's and tell the man to bring the big prize turkey that was hanging there to his house. After getting dressed, Scrooge ran down, and there was the butcher with the turkey. Ebenezer rewarded the boy and paid for the turkey, asking the butcher to deliver it to Bob Cratchit's house immediately, and not to tell him who sent it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim, Scrooge laughed as he went out, walking down the streets with a bounce in his step. And who should he see but the same 2 gentlemen who had come to his office seeking help for the poor. Scrooge stopped them and begged them to come around to his office the next day, promising to do all he could to aid them in their endeavors. Having secured their promise, Scrooge gave a few coins to a group of carolers, and hearing the church bells toll, he cautiously walked into the church, a place he had not been since he was a child, and he gazed upon the nativity scene with a smile that was not forced. His heart was so much lighter than it had ever been, and Scrooge found, as he once more walked the streets, that he could not stop wishing everyone he passed a Merry Christmas, until he at last came to Fred's house. Hesitantly, Ebenezer knocked on the door, and a servant let him in. He smiled at the shocked faces of his nephew and his nephew's wife, and asked if it was too late to accept their invitation to dinner. Fred said he was delighted, absolutely delighted to see him, and Scrooge found he enjoyed himself much more than he thought he would, and he promised that next year he would host the Christmas party at his house. The next day, Scrooge went to the office and chuckled when he saw Bob Cratchit had not yet arrived. Sitting down at his desk, Scrooge hunched over some papers and began scribbling away, trying to look busy and displeased. At last his clerk arrived, and Bob Cratchit looked frightened as he came in and saw Scrooge already there. Scrooge waited a moment before clearing his throat and calling Cratchit over, asking what he meant coming in late. Bob Cratchit begged Scrooge's pardon, saying that he had made rather merry the day before, and was behind his time, but it was once a year, and should not be repeated. Scrooge said indeed it would not be, that he was not going to stand for this a moment longer, and declared then and there he was raising Bob Cratchit's salary. There was a moment of pause, as both Scrooge and Cratchit stared at one another, and then Scrooge began to laugh, much to his clerk's bewilderment. A Merry Christmas, Bob! A Merry Christmas than I have given you in many a year! Scrooge stood up and clapped Bob Cratchit on the shoulder, saying not only was he going to raise his salary, but he was going to help find the best doctors to make Tiny Tim well, and they would discuss all the details over a bowl of Christmas punch later. But first, Bob must go out and buy more coal so they could make up the fire in the office, for it was far too cold. Scrooge was better than his word. He became as good a friend and as good a man as the good old city ever knew. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he became a second father. And it was said by all that Scrooge knew how to keep Christmas well. May that truly be said of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one. The end.